seems like Republicans have a lot to say following President Biden's announcement that the plans to have all U.S. troops removed from Afghanistan by 9/11 of this year. Congresswoman Liz Cheney, whose father was serving as vice president when our troops initially went into that country, voiced her opinion during a press conference yesterday. Here is what she had to say.
I'm not sure why the White House has selected that date, but I can tell you that that is a huge victory, a huge propaganda victory for the Taliban, for al-Qaeda. The notion that on the day that they attacked us, we are going to mark that anniversary by withdrawing our forces. We know that al-Qaeda continues to operate across Afghanistan. We know that the Taliban has not, in fact, lived up to any of the commitments that they made during the previous administration. And we know that this kind of a pullback is reckless, it's dangerous, it puts American security at risk. It will provide an opportunity for terrorists to be able to establish safe havens again. It also puts the women of Afghanistan at risk. It puts the women of Afghanistan into the position that they were in potentially 20 years ago, where their lives are not valued, where they have no freedom. The United States of America went to Afghanistan because our security depended upon it, because we were attacked by al-Qaeda, because the Taliban hosted al-Qaeda. That relationship continues. So a withdrawal of forces that isn't based on conditions on the ground is fundamentally dangerous.
CEO of Pine Street Strategies and host of Smart Folks, Don Calloway, is here, and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Joshinski, join us now to discuss. Emily, I'm taking note of a lot of the neocons here that are coming out here. Should note, it is totally bipartisan. Jeanne Shaheen, Lindsey Graham has a nice little presentation, which I think maybe we'll spare some of that today. Maybe we'll play it. But I'm curious for your thoughts on this, because it's one of the only cleavages I see in politics where there's actual bipartisanship on both sides of this. Rand Paul, Ted Cruz supporting Biden's decision. Jeanne Shaheen, Mitch McConnell, Jim Inhofe, all on the other side of it. What do you make of this?
And I think growing bipartisanship, I'm not sure that in a previous era you would have seen Ted Cruz joining somebody like Rand Paul in a bipartisan coalition. So I think that's an important point. And also, I think, sadly, our sort of muddled response to this, where you have somebody like Liz Cheney coming out and saying, when it's not based on conditions on the ground, and then other people saying, this is exactly what we need, that reflects the muddled the muddled situation on the ground in Afghanistan and the entire muddle that has been the entire war. Right, that set out and then didn't really have specific aims, and is now we're tapering it off without any specific victories, specific accomplishments, or specific reasons in the form of conditions. And so, I think it's a very interesting question, and our country has evolved a lot over the course of this war. And I think, the Beltway underestimates how much of that has happened because of the war, especially in places where people were enlisted at higher rates, which is not, by the way, the Beltway. And so, no, I think that's all really important. But, the sad thing is that I think Liz Cheney has some points, but she's not balancing them with any of the points about our country right now. She did a little bit, but at the same time, she's not balancing them with these fundamental concerns about our troops and what it means for the stretching of the American empire, et cetera, et cetera. So she's just, it's the same thing that it was when we started.
Yeah, these people are pretending to care about women's rights in Afghanistan. Talk to me about women's rights in Saudi Arabia. It's just completely using this talking point in order to justify what has been year after year after year, and now decade after decade of war in Afghanistan. I thought the president's comments yesterday were phenomenal, saying, look, we went there to get bin Laden, and we got there to end the safe haven. No one ever said we're going to unify Afghanistan, which would be impossible and no one has ever done. Don, let me come to you with, let's listen to a little bit of Senator Lindsey Graham and the sort of fear-mongering that he's doing around this.
And now he is withdrawing forces in Afghanistan against sound military advice. To all of you who are listening, you remember where you're at on September 11th, 2001. Our military told President Biden that if you withdraw all of our forces, al-Qaeda and ISIS will come roaring back. Afghanistan would disintegrate into civil war, and we can avoid all of that by having 3,000 to 5,000 American forces, making sure that ISIS and al-Qaeda never come back to hurt us. He rejected that advice. Afghanistan is going to deteriorate pretty rapidly. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are going to come back. He's paving the way for another 9/11.
Don, look, I don't want to play this down. This is very potent politically, right? This sort of fear-mongering approach, that is what has kept president after president in Afghanistan. Just take us a little bit behind the scenes of what President Biden will be up against between now and September 11th.
Well, you just heard it. I mean, Lindsey Graham will make the arguments that this is opening the way for future terrorist attacks. Meanwhile, terrorist attacks, by the way, have not stopped in the 20 years since we have been occupying Afghanistan. We've been engaged in these wars. I just think Lindsey Graham is doing what he's supposed to be doing as the partisan Republican pit bull attack dog of the Senate. So, you know, I think it's actually a little bit beneath the dignity of all of us to respond to things that Lindsey Graham says, because he has no moorings to any part of truth or any fealty to any part of rational thought. And we've seen that on multiple topics now from Lindsey Graham. It really just makes no sense to me. And I actually agree with Emily that Leader Cheney made some legitimate points there. But it really makes no sense to me that anybody on the Republican Party would suggest that President Biden is acting contrary to the advice of military brass. We know that President Biden, while you may or may not agree with any number of decisions that he has to make on the spectrum every day, we certainly know that he's not acting willy-nilly or acting out of self-interest or acting against the advice of military advisors. I was not in the room, but there's nothing in Joe Biden's record as a public official, as vice president or president, that suggests that he would buck the advice of the Pentagon or the people on the ground in Afghanistan. It just makes no sense. We know that Joe Biden is reasonable and very calculating and slow to move based upon these things. So I'm sure he's taken in a substantial amount of advice that suggests that withdrawal
it is
would be
interesting, though, because Don, the Pentagon they're leaking like crazy, being like, actually, we recommended that we stay, etc. Emily, that's really my question to you, which is that look, I don't think the neocons have a real political constituency outside of Washington, but that doesn't mean that they're not incredibly powerful. So in terms of the obstacles that they're going to be up against, it's Liz Cheney, it's Jeanne Shaheen, it's Jim Inhofe. We have people who are the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and you have Mitch McConnell, and you have actual bipartisan constituency here of people who want to stay. Don't forget that Liz Cheney teamed up with a Democrat in order to make sure that to block Trump from taking troops out of Afghanistan not that long ago, only about 6-7 months. So in terms of that, he is up against some very powerful forces here in D.C.
Well, yeah, and there's no ignoring that. I would say, however, I was actually on what I guess you could refer to as Neocon Twitter yesterday, just sort of scrolling through for the word I was using earlier was muddled, and it was very interesting because it was a pretty muddled response. I mean, it was, people saying, let's listen, there are no conditions here. That is very problematic. But other people also saying, like, this has to happen at some point. There's a thoughtful way to do it. So I thought that was really intriguing, and it spoke to, I think, what a poor job they've done with this entire campaign and strategy. And I would say also, it's Republicans and Democrats waged the wars of the early aughts in a very different political and cultural climate in this country. And that's something they do not have to deal with now. That sort of freedom fries, patriotism that was, dominating the country at the time, that's not there anymore. And that was a really powerful force. That was a really powerful force that buoyed these wars. And that, again, that's not something they're dealing with right now. That pressure's gone.
Yeah, I mean, Don, my reaction to Lindsey Graham is a little bit different. When he says Biden's not listening to the military advisors, I say, good, good. Great. Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. In fact, Politico, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but they have a whole piece about how Biden overrode the Pentagon on Afghanistan. They say behind the scenes, it's Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who are truly running the Pentagon. They have an anonymous quote here that says the Pentagon is not making these decisions. And to me, that is probably the best sign that this is actually going to happen.
Perhaps. I mean, I don't think we're far enough into the Biden administration to know who's really pulling the levers of power, to know how powerful Lloyd Austin and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are versus Tony Blinken and his deputy who was confirmed yesterday. But we do know that all of those forces have a say, and those are the last people in the room along with Kamala Harris, when the president has to make a decision. And the president's human, so he's certainly susceptible to different people making arguments and such. I don't know. I read that Politico piece. I don't know who has the dominant voice in the room. What I can say is that I trust this administration to make rational and informed decisions on this far more than I did the previous administration.
Yeah. Well, all right, guys, save it. We're going to have more Team Rising right after this.